The moment my husband set down the phone and told me he had invited his ex-wife to our Thanksgiving table, I felt the air leave the room, and 30 minutes later, when the doorbell rang, he turned so pale I thought he had seen a ghost standing on our porch. Before I tell you what happened next, if you believe in kindness, forgiveness, hope, and second chances, please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment, share it with someone who needs a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel, because stories like this remind us that even broken families can find their way back to grace. And I want you to be part of our growing community of people who still believe that love can repair what life has fractured. My name is Claire Winslow, and for 6 years I had built a quiet, steady life with my husband, Marcus, in a small suburban house outside of Portland, Oregon, the kind of house with a crooked mailbox and a porch swing that creaked in a way that somehow felt like music rather than noise. Marcus was not a man of many words, but the words he did offer were always careful, always weighed before they left his mouth, which was part of why the day he told me about the invitation felt like such a betrayal of the version of him I thought I knew. We had met at a community fundraiser for a children's literacy program, both of us volunteering to read to kids who came from homes where books were a luxury, and I remember watching him kneel down to a little girl's eye level, patiently sounding out a word with her, and thinking that a man who was that gentle with a stranger's child had to have a good heart buried somewhere beneath whatever grief he carried. Because he did carry grief, I could see it even then, folded into the corners of his eyes like a letter he kept meaning to read but never quite could. It took him nearly 8 months to tell me about Diane. Not because he was hiding her, he insisted, but because talking about her felt like reopening a wound that had only just begun to scab over. Diane was his first wife, the woman he had married at 26 and divorced at 32, after a marriage that had crumbled not because of infidelity or cruelty, but because of the quiet, grinding erosion of two people who had grown into different versions of themselves and could no longer recognize the person across the breakfast table. There was a daughter, too, a girl named Poppy, who was 11 when I met Marcus and who split her time between her mother's apartment in Beaverton and our house, where she had her own room painted a soft buttery yellow because she once told her father that yellow felt like the color of being happy. I loved Poppy the way you love a garden you didn't plant but chose to tend anyway, with a fierce, protective devotion that had nothing to do with blood and everything to do with choice. She called me Claire for the first 2 years, and then one Christmas morning, watching me burn the cinnamon rolls for the 3rd year in a row and laugh about it instead of getting upset, she started calling me Mom Claire, a hybrid title that made my chest ache with a happiness I hadn't expected motherhood, even this unconventional kind, to bring me. Diane and I had an arrangement that could generously be called civil and less generously be called distant. We exchanged pleasantries at school events, we coordinated Poppy's schedule through terse but polite text messages, and we had, in 6 years, spoken directly to one another perhaps a dozen times, always about logistics, never about anything that mattered. I did not hate her. I want to be honest about that, because this story only works if you understand that what happened next wasn't born from some simmering rivalry between two women fighting over a man. Diane, from what I could tell, had rebuilt her life with a quiet dignity I respected. She worked as a pediatric nurse, she had raised Poppy with real love even through the difficult years of the divorce, and she had never once, in all the time I'd known of her, tried to make Marcus's new life harder than it needed to be. But there is a difference between respecting someone from a distance and wanting them at your Thanksgiving table, in your home, eating food you cooked, sitting in a chair that used to be empty because it was reserved, unspoken, for the ghost of a marriage that had ended before I ever arrived. So when Marcus came into the kitchen on a rainy Tuesday afternoon in early November, twisting his phone in his hands the way he did when he was nervous, and told me, almost too quickly, that he had invited Diane to Thanksgiving dinner, I felt something in my chest crack clean down the middle. I did not yell. That has never been my way. I set down the wooden spoon I was using to stir a pot of soup, and I asked him, as calmly as I could manage, why. He said Poppy had been struggling. That in the last few months, she had started pulling away from both of us, staying in her room with the door shut, answering questions with single words, and that when he had finally sat her down to ask what was wrong, she had broken into tears and told him that she hated having 2 separate holidays, 2 separate tables, 2 separate families that never touched, And that every single year it felt like she had to choose a version of happiness instead of just getting to have the whole, unbroken thing. Marcus told me that Poppy had said something that broke him open, something like, "I just want one day where I don't have to pretend my family isn't in pieces." And in a moment of desperate, aching love for his daughter, without consulting me, without warning me, without giving me a single second to prepare my heart for it, Marcus had picked up his phone and texted Diane, asking if she would come to Thanksgiving dinner at our house, for Poppy's sake. I want to be honest with you, because honesty is the only thing worth offering in a story like this. My first feeling was not compassion. It was fear, cold and sharp, curling up from my stomach into my throat. I thought about all the ways this could unravel, about old wounds reopening at my dinner table, about awkward silences and forced smiles, about Diane sitting across from me judging the way I seasoned the turkey or arranged the flowers, about some part of Marcus's heart that I had never had access to suddenly being pulled back into the light, right there in front of me, while I was expected to smile and pass the cranberry sauce. I thought about 6 years of carefully built routine, the rhythm Marcus and I had found together, threatening to be disrupted by a woman who had once shared his name, his bed, his whole life before I ever existed in it. I asked him, my voice trembling in a way I hated, whether he had even thought about how this would make me feel. He looked at me then with an expression I will never forget, somewhere between shame and desperation, and said, "I didn't think, Claire. I just heard my daughter crying and I wanted to fix it, and I know that's not fair to you, and I'm sorry, but I already asked her, and she already said yes, and I don't know how to take it back without breaking Poppy's heart all over again." We didn't speak much for the rest of that evening. I busied myself with the kind of tasks that let a person avoid their own feelings, scrubbing counters that were already clean, reorganizing the pantry, anything to keep my hands moving so my mind wouldn't spiral too far into the dark. That night, lying beside Marcus in bed, both of us pretending to be asleep, I thought about Poppy, about the particular loneliness of being a child split between two households, forced into a kind of emotional bilingualism where she had to translate herself differently depending on which parent she was speaking to. I thought about how she used to draw pictures of our family when she was younger, always with two houses connected by a long, winding road, as if she instinctively understood that her life was a bridge rather than a destination. And somewhere in the quiet hours of that sleepless night, my anger began to soften into something more complicated, something closer to grief, grief for the version of Thanksgiving I had imagined, and grief for the little girl who had never asked for any of this and deserved, more than any of the adults in her life, to have one day where the pieces of her world didn't feel so sharp. By morning, I had made a decision, though it did not come easily and it did not come without tears. I told Marcus that I would not undo the invitation. That if Poppy needed this, if this one dinner could give her even a sliver of peace, then I would find a way to open my home and my heart, even if it terrified me. Marcus cried when I told him this, actual tears, which I had only seen him do twice before in 6 years of marriage, once at his mother's funeral and once the day Poppy was born. He held my hands and told me that he loved me, that this didn't change anything between us, that Diane was his past and I was his present and his future, but I noticed, even as he said it, that his hands were shaking, and I wondered if some part of him was as afraid of this dinner as I was, afraid of what old feelings might resurface, afraid of what it might mean to sit across from the woman he had once promised forever to, now with a different woman wearing his ring. The days leading up to Thanksgiving passed in a strange, suspended tension, like the air before a storm breaks. I threw myself into preparation the way some people throw themselves into prayer, meticulously planning the menu, researching Diane's favorite dishes through careful, indirect questions to Poppy, wanting desperately to prove something to myself more than to anyone else, that I could be gracious even when grace was the hardest thing in the world to summon. Poppy, for her part, seemed to float through those days with a lightness I hadn't seen in her for months, humming while she set the table for a dry run 3 days early, taping little handmade place cards to the backs of chairs, including one for her mother that she decorated with tiny drawn flowers, and one for her father, and one for me that said, in her careful looping handwriting, "Mom Claire, the best kind of family you choose." I found that place card on the kitchen counter one afternoon while Poppy was at school, and I stood there holding it for a long time, feeling my resolve to be gracious settle into something more like genuine hope. Thanksgiving morning arrived cold and clear, with a pale winter sun slanting through the kitchen windows as I moved through the familiar choreography of holiday cooking, the turkey season resting, the pies cooling on wire racks, the smell of sage and roasted garlic filling every corner of the house. Marcus helped where he could, though his hands seemed less steady than usual, and twice I caught him staring out the window toward the driveway, as if he could somehow will the hour to slow down. Poppy was a whirlwind of nervous energy, changing her outfit 3 times, asking me repeatedly if her hair looked okay, if the table looked nice enough, if I thought her mother would like the centerpiece she'd made out of pine cones and dried leaves collected from the backyard. I kept telling her yes, it's beautiful, yes, she'll love it, even as my own stomach twisted itself into knots with every passing minute. At exactly the time we had agreed upon, the doorbell rang, and I watched Marcus, who had been calmly folding napkins just moments before, go rigid, his face draining of color so completely and so suddenly that for one terrifying second I thought he might actually be having some kind of medical episode. He set down the napkin in his hand, and I saw his fingers trembling as he did it. I asked him, quietly, urgently, what was wrong, and he didn't answer me. He just walked toward the door with the slow, careful steps of a man walking toward something he wasn't sure he was ready to face. I followed him, my own heart pounding, bracing myself for the moment when I would finally, after 6 years, come face to face with Diane, the woman whose shadow had lived quietly in the corners of our marriage for as long as I had known Marcus. But when Marcus opened the door, it wasn't only Diane standing on the porch. Beside her stood a man I didn't recognize, tall, silver-haired, with kind eyes and a nervous smile, and beside him stood an elderly woman leaning on a cane, and it took me a moment, staring at the 4 of them huddled together in the crisp autumn air, to understand why my husband had turned so pale, because the elderly woman on the porch, the one gripping the cane with white-knuckled hands, was Marcus's mother, a woman everyone in the family believed had died 6 years earlier, the same year. Marcus and Diane's marriage had ended, the same year, would later learn, that had held far more secrets than I ever could have imagined. I need you to sit with that moment for a second, because I certainly had to. 6 years. 6 years I had lived as Marcus's wife, and in that entire time, he had spoken of his mother exactly twice, both times with a grief so raw and so final that I had never once thought to question it. He had told me she passed away from a sudden heart attack the year before we met, that he had been too broken by the timing of it, coming so close on the heels of his divorce, to want to talk about her much, and I had respected that silence the way you respect any grief you haven't lived yourself. I had seen no photographs of a funeral, but grief does strange things to people, and I had never pushed, because pushing felt cruel. Now here she was, very much alive, standing on my porch on Thanksgiving morning, looking at her son with an expression that mixed love and fear and something that looked almost like shame. Marcus stood frozen in the doorway for what felt like an eternity but was probably only 3 or 4 seconds, his mouth opening and closing without sound, and it was Diane, of all people, who finally spoke, her voice gentle but firm, the voice of someone who has clearly rehearsed this moment many times in her head. She said, "Marcus, I think it's time. I think you know it's time." And I watched my husband's face crumple, not into anger, but into something far more fragile, something that looked like a dam finally breaking after years of holding back a flood. He stepped back from the door and let them in, and I found myself standing in my own hallway, surrounded by strangers and half-strangers, watching my husband's mother, a woman I had believed dead for 6 years, reach out with trembling hands to touch her son's face, saying his name over and over, "Marcus, my Marcus, look at you." And Marcus, this towering, steady man I had built a life with, sank to his knees in the entryway of our home and wept like a child. I did not understand yet what was happening, only that whatever it was enormous, and it had been buried for a very long time, and Poppy, sweet Poppy, who had been peeking around the corner from the kitchen, ran forward and threw her arms around both of them, apparently understanding, in the way children sometimes understand things adults have overcomplicated, that this was a moment of reunion rather than tragedy. It took nearly an hour, and several cups of tea, and a great deal of careful, halting conversation before I understood the full shape of what had happened, and I share it now not to shame anyone, but because I believe understanding is the beginning of forgiveness, and forgiveness is the whole reason I'm telling you this story. Marcus's mother, whose name was Rosalind, had suffered what the family had believed at the time to be a fatal heart attack 6 years earlier, in the same terrible month that Marcus and Diane's marriage was collapsing, in the same terrible month that Marcus, by his own tearful admission, had been so consumed by grief and shame over his failing marriage that he had barely been present for anything happening around him. Rosalind had, in fact, survived that heart attack, but the recovery had been long and complicated, involving a stroke during surgery that left her with significant memory loss and a slow, painful road of rehabilitation. During that time, estranged from Marcus's father, who had left the family years before, and unable to reach Marcus directly because of a cruel, tangled mess of miscommunication involving a hospital transfer, a change of phone number, and a family friend who had, through some terrible misunderstanding, told Marcus that his mother had passed rather than that she had been moved to a long-term care facility 2 states away. Rosalind had spent 6 years believing her son had abandoned her, and Marcus had spent 6 years believing his mother was dead. It was Diane, in the end, who had unraveled the truth. In the years since her divorce from Marcus, Diane had remained close with Marcus's extended family, particularly with his aunt, who mentioned in passing, during a conversation that had nothing at all to do with Marcus, that Rosalind was doing better these days, settled comfortably in a care facility outside of Sacramento. Diane, stunned, had spent months quietly investigating, confirming records, tracking down the truth of what had happened, driven not by any obligation to Marcus but by a genuine, aching belief that no mother and son should be kept apart by a misunderstanding when there was still time to fix it. She had visited Rosalind herself, gently explaining the situation, watching the older woman's face crumble with a grief that mirrored her son's, both of them mourning a relationship they believed the other had abandoned. And when Diane finally worked up the courage to tell Marcus the truth, just 2 weeks before Thanksgiving, she had made him promise not to rush the reunion, to give himself and his mother the gentle unveiling this fragile situation demanded, which was why, when Poppy had come to her father in tears about wanting the family whole again, Marcus, already carrying the enormous secret Diane had entrusted him with, had made an impulsive, emotional decision to bring everyone together at once. Believing, in his grief-tangled logic, that maybe the pain of separate holidays could somehow be healed all in one overwhelming, cathartic day. I sat in my living room that Thanksgiving afternoon, watching this scene unfold, and I felt every version of myself collide at once. There was the wife who had spent days bracing for jealousy and tension with an ex-wife, only to discover that the ex-wife had spent months quietly working to reunite her former husband with the mother he believed he had lost. There was the woman who had felt betrayed by a single impulsive text message, only to understand now that the impulsiveness had come from a place of overwhelming love, however clumsily executed. And there was, underneath all of it, a simple human being watching another human being, my husband, weep with a joy so enormous it looked almost like agony, reunited with his mother after 6 years of believing her gone forever. Diane caught my eye across the room at one point, and I expected, foolishly, to feel some old instinct of competition or unease, but instead what passed between us was something closer to solidarity, 2 women who loved the same family in different ways, both of us watching the people we cared about experience something neither of us could have orchestrated alone. She walked over to me eventually, while Marcus and his mother sat together on the couch, his head resting on her shoulder the way I imagined he must have done as a small boy, and Diane said quietly, "I hope I didn't overstep. I just couldn't sit on this and let him keep grieving someone who was alive." I told her, honestly, that she hadn't overstepped at all, that what she had done was one of the kindest things I had ever witnessed, and I meant it with my whole chest. We ate dinner 2 hours later than planned that day, the turkey slightly overcooked, the gravy a little too thick because I'd forgotten to whisk it while everything else fell apart around me, but I don't think anyone at that table cared even slightly about the food. Rosalind sat at the head of the table, a place I had left empty without quite realizing why, some part of me perhaps sensing that a seat needed to be saved for someone, and she told stories about Marcus as a little boy, stories he had never shared with me because I think some part of him had locked away every memory of childhood alongside the grief of losing her, afraid that remembering would hurt too much. Poppy sat between her mother and me, glowing with the particular happiness of a child who has gotten, against all odds, exactly what she wished for. Her family gathered at one table, whole in a way it had never been before. Diane's husband, a soft-spoken man named Trevor who I learned she had married 3 years earlier, helped me clear plates and told me, with genuine warmth, how grateful he was that I had opened my home to all of them, and I found myself, for the first time all day, simply able to breathe. Later that evening, after Rosalind had gone to lie down in the guest room, exhausted but radiant, and Diane and Trevor had said their goodbyes with promises to visit again soon, Marcus found me in the kitchen, washing the last of the dishes in water that had long gone cold. He wrapped his arms around me from behind, resting his chin on my shoulder the way he always did when words felt insufficient, and he told me he was sorry, truly sorry, for the way he had handled the invitation, for not trusting me with the full truth sooner, for putting me through days of fear and uncertainty when he could have simply sat me down and told me everything from the start. He told me that in the chaos of learning his mother was alive, he had made a desperate, imperfect choice, wanting so badly to give Poppy the unified family she had cried for, wanting so badly to somehow compress 6 years of grief and confusion into one healing afternoon, that he hadn't stopped to think about how it would land on me, his wife, the woman who deserved honesty above all else. I turned around in his arms and told him that I forgave him, not because the fear of those days hadn't been real, but because I had watched, with my own eyes, what love looked like when it was clumsy and desperate and trying its best anyway, and I could not find it in myself to hold that against him. If this story is touching something in you right now, I want to pause and ask you to leave a comment below about a time in your own life when forgiveness turned out to be more healing than you ever expected, because I believe our stories, shared together, become a kind of medicine for each other, and I would love to hear yours. In the weeks that followed that extraordinary Thanksgiving, our lives reorganized themselves around a joy none of us had anticipated. Rosalind moved into a small assisted living apartment just 20 minutes from our house, close enough for Marcus to visit her every week, close enough for Poppy to bring her school projects and read to her the way Marcus once read to children at that community fundraiser where he and I had first met. Watching my husband rebuild a relationship with his mother, watching the careful, tender way he relearned her laugh, her habits, the particular way she liked her tea, taught me something about resilience that I don't think I could have learned any other way. Grief, I came to understand, doesn't always mean something has ended. Sometimes it means something has simply been paused, waiting, patient and painful, for the truth to finally catch up. Diane and I, too, found ourselves changed by that day. What had once been a relationship defined by careful distance slowly warmed into something I can only describe as friendship, tentative at first, built on shared logistics about Poppy but gradually deepening into genuine conversations, genuine laughter, genuine care. She began joining us for some of Poppy's school events, sitting beside me instead of across some invisible boundary, and I found that I no longer flinched at her presence the way I once might have, because I had seen, in the clearest possible way, the size and shape of her heart. She had done something for our family that no one had asked her to do, that cost her time and effort and emotional labor with absolutely nothing to gain for herself, and I understood that a person capable of that kind of quiet generosity was not someone to fear but someone to be grateful for. Poppy blossomed in the months after that Thanksgiving in ways that broke my heart open with tenderness every time I noticed them. The girl who had once retreated into silence, who had once told her father through tears that she hated pretending her family wasn't in pieces, began to speak more freely, laugh more easily, invite friends over to a house that now felt, to her, like a place of wholeness rather than division. She started a scrapbook that Christmas, filling it with photographs from that Thanksgiving, Rosalind's wrinkled hands wrapped around a teacup, Diane and I laughing together in the kitchen, Marcus with his head thrown back mid-laugh at one of his mother's old stories, and on the very first page, in her careful, looping handwriting, she had written, "The day my family stopped being broken." I think often about how close we all came to a very different outcome. If I had let my fear win, if I had insisted Marcus rescind the invitation before understanding the full weight of what was happening, if Diane had decided the risk of reopening old wounds wasn't worth the effort, if any one of us had chosen self-protection over vulnerability, we might have missed one of the most healing days our family ever experienced. There is a lesson in that, I think, about the way we sometimes armor ourselves against imagined threats, only to discover that the thing we feared was actually a doorway to something beautiful, if only we were brave enough to walk through it. Marcus's decision to invite Diane wasn't really about Diane at all, in the end. It was about a daughter's aching wish for wholeness, and a mother's unexpected gift of truth, and a family's willingness, even amid fear and uncertainty, to choose connection over comfort. I won't pretend the road afterward was entirely smooth. Rosalind's recovery, both physical and emotional, required patience from all of us, and there were nights when Marcus sat up late, working through waves of grief for the 6 lost years he could never fully reclaim, mourning birthdays and holidays and ordinary Tuesday afternoons he would never get back. I held him through those nights the way he had once held me through my own fears, learning that love, real love, isn't the absence of pain but the willingness to sit beside someone in it, patiently, without trying to rush them toward healing before they're ready. Diane, too, carried her own complicated feelings, telling me once, over coffee, that uncovering the truth about Rosalind had forced her to reckon with her own guilt about the divorce, about wondering whether she had been present enough, attentive enough, during those chaotic months when Marcus's grief over his mother, unknowingly compounded by his belief in her death, had made him distant and difficult to reach. I told her what I believed to be true, that hindsight has a cruel way of making us responsible for things we couldn't have possibly understood at the time, and that the kindest thing any of us could do now was to keep choosing generosity, keep choosing forgiveness, keep choosing each other, moving forward. By the time the following Thanksgiving arrived, almost exactly a year after that extraordinary day, our family had settled into a new rhythm that felt, remarkably, like it had always been meant to exist this way. Rosalind sat once again at the head of the table, stronger now, her memory slowly knitting itself back together with the help of dedicated therapy and the simple, powerful medicine of being surrounded by people who loved her. Diane and Trevor joined us again, this time without any of the fear or tension that had colored the year before, Trevor bringing his famous cornbread stuffing that Poppy declared, with the solemn authority of a 12-year-old, to be the best dish on the table. Poppy herself sat between her two mothers, as she had taken to calling us both, glowing with the particular light of a child who finally understood, in her bones, that family isn't always about the shape you're born into but about the shape you build together, deliberately, with patience and courage and a willingness to keep showing up for one another even when it's difficult. I think about that first terrifying Thanksgiving often, about the version of myself who stood in the kitchen bracing for heartbreak, certain that opening my home to Marcus's ex-wife would somehow diminish what I had built with him. I understand now how wrong I was, not because my fears weren't valid, but because I had underestimated the enormous, redemptive power of choosing love even when love feels risky. Diane didn't come into our home to take anything from me. She came to give something back, a mother to her son, a father to his daughter's sense of wholeness, a family to itself, and in doing so, she gave me something too, a friendship I never expected, a lesson in grace I will carry for the rest of my life, and a deeper, more resilient love with my husband, forged not despite that terrifying day but because of it. If you have made it this far with me, I want you to know that this story is true in every way that matters, even if I've changed the details enough to protect the people I love, because some stories are too tender to tell exactly as they happened, but the heart of it, the truth of forgiveness reshaping a broken family into something whole again, that part one would never change or exaggerate, because it happened in our own home, at our own table, and it changed all of us forever. Before I close this story, I want to ask you something, gently, the way Poppy might ask it, because I think her 12-year-old wisdom captured something the rest of us adults often overcomplicate. Is there someone in your life you've been keeping at arm's length out of old fear or old hurt, someone who might, if you let them close again, surprise you with exactly the kind of grace my family found around that Thanksgiving table? I would love for you to sit with that question in the comments below, to share your own story of unexpected forgiveness, of walls that came down at exactly the right moment, because I believe, more than ever, that these stories we share with each other are how healing spreads, quietly, from one heart to the next. Rosalind passed away peacefully 3 years after that reunion, in the spring, surrounded by her family, by Marcus holding one hand and Poppy holding the other, and by Diane and me standing together at the foot of her bed, both of us weeping for a woman who had, in her final years, taught our entire family what it meant to come home. At her funeral, Marcus stood to speak, and instead of a eulogy focused on loss, he spoke about gratitude, about the 6 years he had grieved a mother who wasn't gone, and the 3 years he had been given afterward to make up for lost time, 3 years he described as the richest, most precious years of his life, made possible only because Diane had cared enough to seek the truth, and because our family had been brave enough, on one terrifying Thanksgiving morning, to open the door instead of keeping it closed. I think about that porch often, about the 4 figures standing there in the crisp November air, about the color draining from my husband's face, about how a moment I feared would break our family apart turned out to be the very thing that made us whole. Life rarely unfolds the way we expect it to, and grief and joy have a way of arriving together, tangled up in ways that seem impossible to untangle until you're standing on the other side of them, looking back with clearer eyes. What I learned that Thanksgiving, and what I carry with me still, is that fear makes a terrible advisor and love, however clumsy and imperfect its execution, is almost always worth the risk. Marcus's impulsive invitation, born from a father's desperate desire to heal his daughter's aching heart, unknowingly became the vessel for a much larger healing, one that reunited a mother and son, deepened a friendship between 2 women who had every reason to remain strangers, and taught a young girl that families, even broken ones, even complicated ones, can find their way back to wholeness if the people within them are brave enough to choose each other, again and again, especially on the days when it would be easier not to. If this story touched your heart even a little, I would be so grateful if you would take a moment to like this video, leave a meaningful comment about the part of the story that moved you most, share it with someone in your life who might need a reminder that second chances are still possible, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another one of these emotional journeys we get to take together as a community. Every comment, every share, every quiet moment you spend sitting with these stories means more to me than I can properly express, because it tells me that somewhere out there, someone else believes, the way I do now, in the enormous, healing, unpredictable power of forgiveness, and in the families we build not by accident, but by choice, one imperfect, courageous Thanksgiving at a time.